That's a very important concept. Talked about in a more recent sense, the recent arrival or coming rather to Ireland of Muhammad Ali to visit the home of his great-grandfather. You know, it's a great applause. You have a situation where you have a man left Ireland. He went to the United States. He married a woman who was a freed, enslaved African. The only children that he ever had were with this woman. He married her. And so here you have an Irishman whose only descendants are to be found in a group that is categorically said to be in a different race. His only descendants are African Americans. But he's an Irishman and a European. Again, think about this whole issue of genealogy and relationship versus other ways of categorization. Likewise, Matthew Henson, the great polar explorer who went with Perry, African American, only had children, biological children, who were Inuit. So if you go to Greenland today, you can find people with names like Inuit Henson, you know, and they all look like Inuit today. And they all kill seals and they eat raw fish. They do all of the things that Inuit do, but they have this name Henson, and they know who their great-great-grandfather was. But they are Inuit. They are not black people. But if they come to South Carolina, where the definition is, if you have any known African ancestors, you are a black person, then they get transformed into something different. Very interesting idea. Again, in that case, based on social phenomena. The Nile Valley. Nile Valley is in Africa, northeastern Africa, and this helps us to situate its culture and its proximate peopling and peopling. The archaeological studies done recently by Fred Windorf and by Kruper and Capellan tell us that in the early Holocene period, between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, that there were more sites in the Sahara suggestive of habitation than there were in the Nile Valley. Previous to this time, in the late Pleistocene, Holocene, we clearly have evidence of greater habitation along the Nile Valley. Now, many prehistorians suggest that there was a hiatus in the Nile Valley, but of course I believe that there still were always some people there. Nevertheless, we have these Saharan habitation sites, and later on, by the mid-Holocene, we see that the Saharan habitation sites have decreased in number, and that we have a huge number of settlements along the Nile. Now, from a cultural point of view, this is important because it suggests a shift in population density. Now, this by itself doesn't tell you where the people that are represented in these sites came from, but it does give you some clue about the habitation in that part of northeastern Africa and changes in population density. The archaeology, on the other hand, which has long been observed, not just recently with Fred Windorf and others, Hassan and all of the other groups, but even back in the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, Vigor and Chow noted that there was something about the cultures of Merenda, the Neolithic in the northern Nile Delta, and even in Khartoum, where you had the well-known Mesolithic cultures, there was something about them that Vigor and Chow thought indicated that they had, perhaps it had a common root, perhaps in the Sahara. So that idea is not new, but now with the material from Nabta Playa that you know about, Fred Windorf and others, and the other material from other investigators, Colin Hogan and what have you, Fikri Hassan was able to say some 20 years ago that there seemed as though there were a coherent set of Saharan traditions mixed with the Nilotic hunting traditions that came together in the pre-dynastic. Now, when we look at the pottery from Nabta Playa, the earliest pottery has black top like this, but it doesn't have the ripples. The earliest rippling in pottery in the Nile Valley comes from the Sudan. And in the Badarian pottery, which this is the rim of Badarian pottery, you have both traditions, the black top and the rippling. At Nabta Playa, you have evidence of an interest in large stone structures, stone cow that is buried, sculpted cow that is buried, and a huge capstone, and other developments that have been suggested feed into pre-dynastic Egypt. The crops that we have in Egypt at this time, I mean, at the beginning of the Neolithic, of course, though, in some cases come from the Near East. Wheat and barley agriculture, as well as the domesticated ovicaprines, the goat and sheep. There's no question, because there are no wild species of those to be cultivated in Africa, and there's no question that that's where they came from. However, just because those crops came from there doesn't mean that there was a mass migration. This is a point of contention in some circles. If you look at the earliest Fayum culture, the one that has been, not the earliest, but the second layer, it's called Neolithic. What one notices is that the Fayumian folk of that time were not practicing year-round agriculture. They rather supplemented a hunting strategy with agriculture. So there's no indication of the kind of mass movement that you see, say, from the Near East into Southern Europe, of a total revolution in lifestyle. Rather, what you seem to have is local people who adopt one sort of resource strategy. Also, there's some other linguistic things that I'll talk about later, but so there is no mass movement, or there's no archaeological evidence for this that would support a simple demic diffusion. Agriculture began, wheat and barley agriculture, some 2,000 years in the Levant, in Palestine, before in Egypt. So you had 2,000 years to for this demic diffusion, if it were going to have happened, to have occurred. Furthermore, and I'm getting ahead of the story, when you reconstruct vocabulary for agricultural items back in Proto-Semitic, you find all of the items there in Semitic. If there had been a simple mass migration of people into the Nile Valley, they would have been speaking Semitic, but they're not. I mean, ancient Egyptian is not Semitic. They're in the same family, but they're not the same languages. That 2,000 gap is very important to remember. We don't have a wholesale revolution, change in strategy at the earliest Egyptian Neolithic in the north. Furthermore, we use Neolithic broadly to mean food production. What we have is, we get another piece of information that's significant. Namely, that cattle seem to have been domesticated at Nabta in southern Egypt, or the western desert, and perhaps even domesticated first by Nilo-Saharan speakers as opposed to Afro-Asiatic speakers. So you have two sources of Neolithic coming into the Nile Valley. The illustration here of the pallets and the stone tools. The pallets, the evidence for some pallets in the early Sahara, they later on developed into these other motifs. The pharaoh with the tail as a part of the pharaonic dress can also be seen in the Sahara. So pottery traditions that we see in earliest pre-dynastic Egypt with the Badarian, as well as the stone tools, point to an indigenous African development. The issue of where domesticates come from, that is to say, the animals and plants used for food, they are both local, nilotic things. But the key and core crops are, the wheat, barley come from the Near East, but they've been adopted on the basis of the strategy